Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is writer, director, composer, and film editor Jeff Barnaby. Jeff was born on a Mi'kmaq reserve in Listigouche, Quebec. His latest film, the zombie thriller Bloodquantum, was just released to the masses at a time of a global pandemic. Jeff, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show, even if it is via Skype. Bloodquantum is now out for all to see. How does that feel for you?
Just a giant relief, to be honest. I'm just happy that it's out anywhere and it's getting seen, because there was a point where, that was really up in the air and we didn't know if that was going to transpire or not. So, on top of a pretty good launch, it's just good to have the film being seen after working on it for what feels like half of my adult life.
Of course, it is out in a way, I guess, that maybe you hadn't hoped for. Instead of the theatrical release, it's video on demand. Was that a bit of a disappointment for you?
Oh, absolutely not. I think when you're dealing with a marginalized filmmaker, and I think when you're lucky enough to be one of the few Native people that are able to make films, you're just glad to have a platform and have an opportunity to get your work shown anywhere. So I feel super lucky and privileged to be in a position to be able to even question whether it's what would be a better launch at theater or video on demand, when 99% of filmmakers don't get to ask that question at all.
True enough, and I guess at least everybody's at home right now. Judging by the posts I've seen online, a lot of people seem to have watched it already. What's been the reaction you're hearing?
Pretty positive. I think people are getting it, and I think the idea that we're in the middle of a pandemic, watching it in the middle of a pandemic, it exacerbates a lot of the politics that are already in the film. So I think that definitely helped, as crazy as that may sound. Mm-hmm. The idea that the pandemic happened and kept the film out of theaters is actually the reason why I think it's so successful.
It's had some great reviews. The Globe and Mail wrote it's as much a gutsy dissection of colonialism as it is a gut-spilling splatterthon. Was that pretty much exactly what you set out to do with Bloodquantum?
Yeah, I think we leaned a little bit more into making just a fun zombie movie than making any kind of social satire or political statement. I think when you're Native and you have all that history behind you in cinema, 9 times out of 10, those politics are going to be infused just by virtue of having that Native person on screen. And in a modern context, not running around in buckskin. So I think once you do that, you throw some blockades in there, I don't really think you don't need to drive the points home any harder.
So, Jeff, the film has images of the Oka crisis, and it's set in the year when your home community of Listigouche was raided by Quebec provincial police over a salmon fishing dispute. And, of course, the bridge where some of those arrests happened is pretty prominent in the film. Why did you want to include those?
I just wanted to pay homage to Alanisa Bumswin, who's been inspiring me to make films since I saw Incident Eriskush. And I wanted to call back into the contemporary discussion, that history of conflict that has been fairly recent in our generation, because I find a lot of the conversation happens either in the moment, the protests we're seeing right now, or it's ancient history, when it's really just been one long event, one long drawn out event from the catalyst of colonialism turned into capitalism. And I think we're just having the same conversation over the course of hundreds of years. And I wanted to kind of put all that stuff into the film without making a direct allusion to it. And I thought the iconic imagery from a lot of Alanice's films did that without really having to blatantly point it out in the film, because I felt like if you did that, you can alienate certain audience members, and I really wanted to make a film for Native people, but at the same time that it wouldn't be exclusively appreciated by Native people. So those hints are in there. If you've seen Alanice's films, you'll be able to see not just those images, but images scattered all throughout the documentary, both their documentaries, Incident at Restoration, 270 Years of Resistance. Those are two ones that I draw from the most. You'll be able to see images and ideas littered really all throughout the film. And I just wanted to make a film that was more zombie fun and carried that political message. And it was so easy to lean into her movies, because that, again, those images are very iconic, and I think they're part of the cultural zeitgeist of Canada and Canadian cinema. And it was it's a nice Easter egg for people who know. And I think the great thing about it is, because of the popularity of trying to make that kind of popcorn zombie film, people are going and getting to know that film. And I think being educated in the process without, right? I mean, you go see a movie that has some of the content that Bloodquantum has, it's going to go draw you to these other films. But that was kind of part of what I was trying to do too. It was to educate people. It seems absurd, but I was trying to do it in a way that would initiate the viewer to go out and look at those films, or look for those films, rather than, try to put people down in a classroom and it's like, this is what you need to learn. It was kind of like, look how amazing and interesting this history is. Why don't you go and see if you can dig some of it up for yourself? We haven't forgot. And it's particularly interesting too, because some of those old wounds are being exacerbated with the tension created by COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And the same way some of the politics in the film are being brought to the foreground because of the virus. It's a weird time to be alive, man. The whole thing is just strange and surreal.
It certainly is, and we would also recommend that people go and check out Alanice's nearly 100 films. Jeff, you said
that's the other thing too. Like, who has 100 filmography? I mean, that's crazy. If you know how much work goes into making a film, the idea that she's made 100 of them is absurd. That woman is not human.
We're going to talk about some of your earlier work. You just have to throw to a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Jeff Barnaby.
Ain't nobody immune here but us.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is filmmaker Jeff Barnaby, whose latest flick, Bloodquantum, was recently released. Jeff, wondering, when did you decide you wanted to pursue a career in film?
Still debating, actually. I don't know. I kind of took it. It took me by surprise almost. I didn't have one particular credit in my university, not even university, college, when I was going to Chez in Quebec to fill out. I needed to fill out my course load, so I took an elective in film, and it turns out I had a real aptitude for it. Mm. So at the encouragement of my instructors, my professors, I took a production course, and then I was kind of struck. Well, trying to find a nice way to say this. But I saw my work compared to the people that have been talking about being filmmakers like their entire life, and I knew just by comparison that I had a particular aesthetic vision, and I understood it. I understood the process of filmmaking quite well, and in retrospect, I understand. Like I have a background in art and music and writing. Prior to this, I'd wanted to be a writer. I thought I was going to be writing. That's really what I wanted to be or possibly comic books. One of those two things. So when I took the film course, I aced it. And then I took the production course, and it ended up being like the most well-received film out of the 40, 50, 60 films that we do per student during the student film festival. Was the most well-received film that year. So I was like, maybe I should go to film school. And then I went to film school. The film I did there while I was still in school made it to Sundance. And then from that point on, it was kind of like taking it seriously. Maybe I can really do this. I worked at a production house for a while that did language revitalization docs called Finding Our Talk. It was actually for APTN. So I did that for 4 years, and that really imbued in me the sense of love of my language. It was already there too, because my mom was a language teacher. And it just made me want to take some of the things that I was seeing in the documentary world with language and put it in the fictional world, because it was the world that I grew up in too, where everybody that I grew up around was speaking in this mix of Mi'kmaq and English. So it all was just a big kind of catching lightning in a bottle moment, where I was doing all this stuff and it just all came together in making films, because I was still able to do music. I was still able to represent my culture. I was still able to draw. I was still able to, just have all these outlets for all this creative energy that I had carrying around. And it just kind of spiraled from there. There was a point where my film career wasn't going anywhere, and I moved home, and I was like a construction worker, carpenter / lumberjack for about a year. And I came back, and that's when we did The Colony. And from that point on, I never really looked back. I just, I've been lucky enough to work on my own material this whole time.
Jeff, you mentioned Alanaise, but what were some of the movies and filmmakers that inspired you?
At the time, I was like everybody else. I was enamored with Pulp Fiction. But by then, I was already indoctrinated into horror movies like Romero stuff, Evil Dead, like all the zombie stuff in the early 80s. That's what I was watching. Return of the Living Dead, all the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff. But I was also reading a lot. I was also reading a lot of horror. And that's when I got introduced to Clive Barker. And that's when my sensibilities really developed, where they really developed, because you were seeing things in horror that were kind of extreme. But once Clive Barker showed up and he did Hellraiser, and he released all those great fantasy books in the 80s and the early 90s, like a Magica and Great and Secret Show. He was taking extreme horror and kind of mixing it up with eroticism and fantasy and gender politics, because Clive himself is gay and represents that quite well in his work. So that, for me, was really where my sensibilities developed, in that realm of almost anything goes horror extremism. And then I started getting more attracted to French extreme filmmaking. The high tensions and another one that I really like. A lot of Gaspar Noir's work, even though it's a little pretentious, was pretty interesting cinematically. So it was a lot of different stuff that informs, and comic books to this day. I still get. I'm like, to me right now, the most interesting stuff going on story-wise is in comics. So I'm really drawing from everything, and then I'm filtering it all through this lens of growing up on a reserve in foster care and the people that I experienced growing up there. And that's really where my cinema comes from. That's really, being influenced by everything, including my life and the people in my life, and putting them in these fantastic situations. And I think to a certain extent, there's a real desire for that stuff on reserves, because you have a lot of big horror fans, but no real presence in horror films as either creators or people in horror situations. I think really ironically, the only person really is Michael Greyeyes, who did Fear the Walking Dead.
And is in Bloodquantum. You started out with short films that were selected for the Toronto International Film Festival. file under miscellaneous about a Mi'kmaq man who undergoes surgery to become white was nominated for a Genie Award. Were you surprised with the success you were having early on?
No, not at all. Because I knew, like I said, I knew right from the beginning I had a different aesthetic. I knew, and then when I started really getting into the film world and I saw what was going on in the Canadian film world, I was like, this place is ripe for the kind of cinema that I'm bringing to screen. And I knew there was nobody really out there doing what I was doing. Plus, I knew I had a really polished aesthetic that came from, years of art school and, getting my start as a filmmaker, as a production designer, that kind of stuff. I knew wasn't really in Canadian cinema. And then you add the fact that I'm a native filmmaker, and I knew I was going to be an anomaly in not only native cinema, or not native cinema, but Canadian cinema, U.S. cinema, Western cinema. So I knew that voice needed to be there just by virtue of like 100 years of seeing native people in cinema. It's like, wouldn't you guys love to see an actual native person control that image and see what he comes up with? And it took a little while for people to really warm up to that idea. But then you flash forward and you see Taika winning Oscars. You see the reception to Bloodquantum. And I think right now is really the best place and time to be a native filmmaker.
Well, and you did an amazing job on Bloodquantum. Jeff, we do have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face.
Now I'm home. That ain't no little girl no more. We're supposed to take care of her, Burner, not her take care of you.
You even know your girl, man? You can eat people after the apocalypse.
Don't look, Joyce! Don't look!
I aged by 1,000 years.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is filmmaker Jeff Barnaby. And Jeff, just wondering, what are your thoughts on the Canadian film industry right now?
It's a bittersweet industry for me because on one hand, it allows me to exist and gives me really the real creative freedom with what I'm doing. But at the same time, I would like to see more native filmmakers get that opportunity. And I think you're starting to see it now. Mm-hmm. You see El Maya made quite a ruckus with her film last year, and she's a gifted filmmaker. So you're going to start seeing more from her. Nihilist film Slashback is coming out. Danis Goulet's film Night Raiders is coming out. So I think you're going to start seeing a lot more work from native filmmakers, and I think that's to the Canadian film industry's credit. Now, of course, that being said, we can still do more. I keep talking about the New Zealand model that gave us Taika, and to have that kind of support for a native filmmaker here, where we don't have to stop filmmaking in the middle of the shoot to go and raise more money and come back and turn everything into a kind of battle with the budget. Like nobody, every filmmaker at some point is going to die on that hill, the budget. But mm-hmm. I think a lot more Indians have died on that budget hill than a lot of other filmmakers, and I don't think that really reflects how much the amount of success our films get. Like this past year, I don't think it would be remiss to say that El Maya's film was probably the best well-received Canadian film of the year, and I think it should be. I think the kind of attention that we get as native filmmakers should be reflected in the budgets that we get, to put it bluntly. So I think that being said, the Canadian industry is starting to make slow, albeit reluctant, slow steps towards that. And films like El Maya's and films like mine really help that. And I think Nihilist film Slashback and I think Danis's film are going to reinforce those ideas that some of the best filmmakers in Canada are indeed native and, more to the point, women.
Consequence of Sound, in their review, said that Bloodquantum is an important step forward for Indigenous filmmaking. Is that something you'd agree with?
Well, I mean, that's a great statement, but I mean, you don't really know until you start seeing it play out. But I think, yes, I think it is an important step. But by the same token, I think there's a, a pan-Indianism there almost, to say that I'm reflective of all the tribes out there making films, because I guarantee you not every Indian that sees his movie is going to like it or think it reflects their personal tribe. So I think that's kind of to a certain extent, I think the positive attention for the film is good for Native cinema, but you don't want to lean too hard into it, because this is first and foremost a Micmac film, and then I think you can start drawing connections between what we've experienced and what other Native cultures experience. The common thread there being colonialism.
So you're writing your next feature. Are you able to tell us what it's going to be about?
It's a cosmic horror film about the end of the world, and it's about a young girl that tries to escape a city under quarantine to get back to her reserve. And it's a bit of a road film, and it's while she's going, she's seeing all these different things that are portents to the end of the world, as if it's forecast. So we're using those as anchors to give us an idea where the Native tropes in horror came from. So, like, say the cemetery in Pet Sematary is going to be like one of the summoning points for the great old ones that come and end the world. You have to be a cosmic horror fan to understand the words coming out of my mouth. But I think there's no better vehicle to express the existential dread that everybody's feeling right now from the virus. Because even like nuclear war, you can picture a nuclear warhead and the explosion, so you know what to fear. But here, there is, like, really what you're fearing is it's invisible, and you never know when it's going to strike or how it's going to strike. And I think there's no better vehicle to really nail that feeling of dread than cosmic horror. So that's what I'm writing now. I've already written a television show that's making the rounds, and I'm hoping that Bloodquantum raises the profile on that a little. And I think just keep promoting Native culture, Native cinema.
Well, and Jeff, we wish you all the luck with those projects and continued success, hopefully, here with Bloodquantum. Jeff, real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time.
And that is all the time we have for today. This show and past episodes are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dennis Ward. We'll see you next week.